The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever dared to challenge their authority. No civilization had ever been foolish enough to stand against the combined might of 4,000 member races. And no primitive newcomer had ever done anything but bow their heads and accept their place in the grand order of things. Humanity was supposed to be no different when the first human ships had crawled out of their tiny solar system 60 years ago. The Council had watched with mild curiosity and nothing more, for they had seen this story play out countless times before, and they knew exactly how it would end, as it always ended, with another species learning its place and accepting the chains of civilization. The humans were given a designation in the Great Registry, Species 7431, a number that meant nothing and everything at the same time, for it told the galaxy exactly where humanity stood in the hierarchy of things. Somewhere between the bottom and absolutely nowhere at all. Ambassador Chen Wei remembered the day he had first walked into the council chambers, his heart full of hope and his mind full of dreams about what humanity might become among the stars. And he remembered how quickly those dreams had turned to ash in his mouth. The Valinari delegate had refused to acknowledge his presence for 3 hours, simply pretending he did not exist while conducting other business. And when the alien had finally turned those cold, compound eyes toward him, the words that came out were not a greeting but a dismissal. "You may observe," the Valinari had said, "but you may not speak unless spoken to, for your species has not yet earned the right to have a voice in these halls." That had been 60 years ago, and nothing had changed since then. Nothing except the slow-burning fire that had begun to grow in the hearts of every human who had ever been told they were not good enough, not advanced enough, not worthy enough to stand as equals among the stars. The restrictions came one after another, each one a small humiliation designed to remind humanity of its place. And the humans had accepted them because what choice did they have? Against the combined might of the galaxy, its self-trade restrictions meant human merchants could only sell their goods at a fraction of their true value while paying triple for anything they wished to buy from the elder races. And quarantine zones meant human ships could not travel beyond the boundary markers that the Council had drawn around their tiny corner of space like a fence around a cage. But the worst part was not the restrictions or the humiliations or even the casual cruelty that the elder races showed toward humanity at every turn. No, the worst part was the way they laughed, the way they looked at humans like they were amusing little creatures playing at civilization, like children pretending to be adults. Ambassador Chen Wei had grown old in the service of his people, watching year after year as humanity tried to prove itself worthy of respect and failed every single time. Not because humans were not capable, but because the game was rigged from the start, and everyone knew it except the ones who kept hoping things would change. Then came the day that changed everything. The day that would be remembered in human history as the moment when hope finally died and something else was born in its place. Something darker and more dangerous than anyone in the galaxy had ever seen. The colony ship Horizons Dream had been carrying 40,000 souls toward a new world, a planet that humanity had discovered beyond the boundary markers, a world that the Council had declared off limits, but that humans had decided to claim anyway because they were tired of being told where they could and could not go. The ship never reached its destination. Commander Yuki Tanaka was on duty at the Mars relay station when the distress signal came through, and she would never forget the sound of those final transmissions, the screams and the chaos, and then the terrible silence that followed. "This is Horizon's Dream," the captain had called out, his voice steady even as his ship died around him. "We are under attack by Dominion patrol vessels. They are not responding to our surrender signals. They are not taking prisoners. Tell Earth tell everyone. Tell them what happened here today. And then there was nothing but static. The Dominion was one of the most powerful factions within the Galactic Council, a collection of insectoid species that had built their empire on conquest and maintained it through fear. And they had decided that humanity's attempt to expand beyond its designated boundaries was an insult that could not be tolerated. 40,000 men and women and children, gone in an instant, erased from existence because they had dared to dream of something more than the cage the galaxy had built for them. The Galactic Council convened a tribunal to address the incident. And Ambassador Chen Wei stood before the assembled delegates with tears in his eyes and rage in his heart, demanding justice for his people, demanding that someone be held accountable for the murder of 40,000 innocent souls. The Dominion ambassador was a towering insectoid creature named HFY, and he sat in his designated seat with an expression that might have been amusement on his chitinous face, showing no remorse and no concern as the human ambassador pleaded for justice. The actions of the Dominion patrol were lawful and appropriate, the council arbiter declared after 3 days of deliberation. The human vessel was in violation of boundary marker regulations, and the Dominion was within its rights to enforce compliance through any means necessary. No reparations would be paid. No apology would be offered, and no one would be punished for the deaths of 40,000 human beings. Ambassador Chen Wei stood frozen in the center of the chamber as the verdict was read, unable to believe what he was hearing, unable to process the casual dismissal of so much death and suffering. And then he heard it, a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The clicking laughter of Ambassador HFY echoing through the chamber as the insectoid creature celebrated another victory over the primitive humans who thought they deserved to be treated as equal. Something broke inside Chen Wei in that moment, something that had been holding back the tide of anger and grief and despair that had been building for 60 years. And when he returned to Earth 3 days later, he carried with him not a plea for patience, but a recommendation for war. The United Earth Parliament convened an emergency session, and the debates raged for 72 hours straight, with some calling for caution and others calling for vengeance, and still others simply weeping for what had been lost and what was about to be lost. In the end, the vote was unanimous. Humanity declared war on the Galactic Dominion. Ambassador HFY received the formal declaration, and his response was recorded for posterity, a moment that would be played on every human screen for generations to come, a reminder of the arrogance that had brought them to this point. How amusing, the insectoid ambassador had said, his mandibles clicking with laughter. Schedule their extinction for the next rotation. He had no idea what he had just awakened. High Counselor Irenathus had lived for 900 years, and in all that time, he had never once felt anything resembling concern when a lesser species made threats against the established order. For he had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore, and he knew that the galaxy always returned to its natural state of balance under the wise guidance of the Council. The emergency session he had called was more about protocol than genuine worry, a formality that needed to be observed so that future historians would note that the Council had taken the human threat seriously, even though everyone in the chamber knew there was no threat at all. The holographic displays flickered to life around the great circular chamber, showing the assembled delegates everything they needed to know about the species that had just declared war on one of the most powerful factions in known space. 200 warships, the display read, and several delegates actually laughed at the number, for the Dominion alone commanded 80,000 vessels, and the combined fleet of the Council could field over 1 million ships of war. If the need ever arose, 12 colony worlds, with a combined population of 4 billion souls, and another 15 billion living on the human homeworld called Earth. Numbers that seemed impressive until you remembered that the Velinari breeding worlds produce that many individuals every single year. "This is not a war," declared Admiral Vethtorek of the Dominion Fleet, his compound eyes gleaming with anticipation. "This is pest control, and I volunteer my forces to handle the extermination personally." The chamber erupted in what passed for laughter among the elder races. A cacophony of clicks and whistles and rumbling. Sounds that filled the air with contempt for the foolish humans who thought they could challenge the natural order of the Galaxy High Counselor Aeronathos allowed the mirth to continue for several moments before raising one of his forearms to signal for silence, his ancient face showing nothing of his own thoughts on the matter. "Let us hear from our military strategists," he said in his deep, resonant voice, "so that we may determine the most efficient way to resolve this unfortunate situation." The Velinari delegation was first to present their analysis, their compound minds having already calculated every variable and determined every outcome with mathematical precision based on our projections. The lead strategist announced, "The human resistance will collapse within 4.7 standard rotations, assuming we commit a minimum force of 500 vessels to the campaign." The crystalline hegemony disagreed, their representative's body chiming with harmonic frequencies as it offered its own assessment. "Our calculations suggest 3.2 rotations at most," the crystalline being sang, "for the humans lack the industrial capacity to replace their losses, and their morale will shatter once they witness the true power of the Dominion fleet." Other races offered their own predictions, each one more dismissive than the last, until it seemed like a competition to see who could show the most contempt for the doomed species that had dared to stand against the galaxy, the oldest race in the chamber. The Orium rarely spoke at council sessions, for they had long ago grown tired of the petty squabbles of younger civilizations. But when they did speak, everyone listened because the Orium had been ancient when the first council was formed, and they would likely still be ancient when the last council crumbled to dust. Their message appeared on every display in the chamber simultaneously. Just 3 words that seemed to carry the weight of ages behind them. "Unfortunate," the message read. They showed promise, and that it seemed was the final word on the matter. A eulogy for a species that was already dead, even if they did not know it yet. But there was one voice that had not yet been heard. One delegate who sat in the shadows at the edge of the chamber, watching and listening and growing more concerned with every passing moment. Observer Thalmira was not a military strategist or a political leader, but an archivist, a scholar who had dedicated her life to studying the newcomer species that emerged from the darkness of space, trying to understand what made each one unique and what they might contribute to the grand tapestry of galactic civilization. She had spent 40 years studying humanity, longer than any other scholar in the council service, and what she had learned during those decades filled her with a dread that none of her colleagues seemed to share. When she requested the floor, the other delegates looked at her with confusion and mild annoyance. For what could an archivist possibly have to say about military matters? High Counselor Aeronathos granted her request with a gesture of indulgence. Expecting nothing more than a mere footnote to the proceedings, Lemaire rose from her seat and walked to the center of the chamber, her 4 legs carrying her with a grace that belied her advanced age. And when she reached the presentation platform, she did not call up charts or projections or military assessments. Instead, she displayed a single image, a photograph that had been taken on Earth over 400 years ago during something the humans called the Blitz. The image showed a human city in ruins, buildings collapsed and fires burning everywhere, the sky dark with smoke and the streets filled with rubble. And in the center of all that destruction stood a single human being, a woman with blood on her face and dust in her hair, climbing out of the wreckage with her fists clenched and her eyes blazing with defiance. "Counselors," Thalmira said, her voice quiet but somehow carrying to every corner of the chamber, I have studied species 7431 for 40 years. Longer than most of you have been aware they existed. I must warn you that our projections may be dangerously optimistic. A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber, for no one had expected the old archivist to challenge the consensus. I have read their histories, Thalmira continued. I have studied their wars and their disasters and their moments of greatest crisis. And I have found something in those records that troubles me deeply. She gestured at the image of the woman in the ruins. The human who refused to stay down, even when everything around her had been destroyed. They do not surrender, Thalmira said. Not the way other species surrender, not the way our models predict. They do not calculate acceptable losses or weigh the odds of victory against the cost of defeat. The Velinari strategist made a dismissive gesture with several of its limbs. All species surrender when the mathematics become unfavorable, it declared. This is a universal constant that is held true for every conflict in recorded history. Thalmira shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the image on the display. You do not understand, she said. When humans are broken, when their cities burn and their armies fall and all hope seems lost, they do not stop, they do not give up, they do not accept their fate. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her final warning. They simply become angry. The chamber fell silent for a long moment, and Thalmira could see the confusion on the faces of the assembled delegates, for they could not comprehend what she was trying to tell them. This image, she said, pointing at the woman in the ruins, was taken during a war on their homeworld, a war they were losing badly, a war that should have ended with their defeat and subjugation. She turned to face the High Counselor directly. They won that war, she said, not because they had superior numbers or better weapons or more resources, but because they refused to accept that they had lost, because they kept fighting long after any rational species would have surrendered. Admiral Vethtorik's mandibles clicked with impatience. Ancient history, the Dominion commander declared. Primitive conflicts between primitive peoples. Our weapons will end this war before they have a chance to display whatever stubborn tendencies you believe them to possess. Thalmira looked at the admiral with something that might have been pity. You will destroy their fleets, she said. You will burn their colonies and bombard their homeworld and kill billions of their people. And you will think you have won. She turned back to the image of the defiant woman, the human who had risen from the ashes of destruction, and then you will discover what humanity truly is. The council dismissed her concerns with polite murmurs and returned to the business of planning humanity's extinction, never knowing that the old archivist had just given them the only warning they would ever receive within the week. The Dominion fleet would begin its march toward human space. Confident in their inevitable victory, they had no idea how wrong they were. Admiral Vethtorik stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching the stars streak past as his fleet of 500 warships jumped toward human space. And he felt nothing but contempt for the primitive species he'd been sent to destroy. This would not be a war. He thought to himself, this would be a lesson, a demonstration of what happened to lesser races who forgot their place in the natural order of things. The jump took 3 days, and when the fleet emerged at the edge of human territory, the admiral expected to find defensive positions and patrol vessels and all the usual preparations that a species made when facing invasion. Instead, he found nothing. The relay stations that should have been broadcasting warnings and coordinating defenses were dark and silent. Their power cores cold and their communication arrays shattered beyond repair. The jump gates that should have allowed rapid travel through human space were gone, collapsed into twisted metal and scattered debris, destroyed so thoroughly that it would take years to rebuild them. Scans show no enemy vessels within detection range, reported one of his officers. Confusion evident in the way its antennae twitched. and the humans have destroyed their own infrastructure. Admiral Vethtorak stared at the debris field that had once been a jump gate and felt the first tiny seed of uncertainty plant itself in his mind. Why would any species destroy its own assets? He wondered. Why would they cripple their own ability to move and communicate and defend their territory? The answer came to him slowly. And when it did, he pushed it away because it was too insane to be believed. They want to trap us here, he realized. They want to slow us down and force us to travel through real space where we will be vulnerable and exposed. But that made no sense because the humans could not possibly win a war of attrition. They did not have the numbers or the resources to outlast the Dominion fleet. So why would they sacrifice their own mobility just to delay the inevitable? The admiral shook off his doubts and ordered the fleet to proceed toward the nearest human colony world, a planet called New Helsinki that the intelligence reports described as a frozen wasteland, barely capable of supporting life. It took 6 weeks to reach the planet. 6 weeks of crawling through space at sublight speeds, because the humans had destroyed every shortcut and every convenience that would have allowed faster travel. When the fleet finally arrived at New Helsinki and began their scans of the surface, they found empty cities and abandoned settlements and not a single human being anywhere. The colonists had vanished into the frozen wilderness, taking everything they could carry and destroying everything they could not, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and shattered buildings and a message burned into the ice shelf large enough to be seen from orbit. Come and take it to. Admiral Vethtorak felt his mandibles click together in frustration as he stared at those 4 words. Those 4 defiant words that seemed to mock everything he represented. He sent ground forces to search the wilderness, and they found nothing but empty caves and false trails and traps that killed dozens of soldiers before the search was finally abandoned. The humans were out there somewhere, hiding in the frozen darkness, waiting for something that the admiral could not understand. He left the garrison behind and ordered the fleet to continue toward the next colony world, and the next after that. And at each one, they found the same thing: empty cities, destroyed infrastructure, and messages of defiance written in fire and blood and ice. The human fleet appeared for the first time near the asteroid belt of a system called Kepler's Rest, and Admiral Vethtorak felt a surge of satisfaction at finally having an enemy he could destroy. But the humans did not fight the way any rational species fought. They struck at supply convoys and fled before the main fleet could respond. They ambushed patrol vessels in asteroid fields and disappeared into the darkness before reinforcements could arrive. They attacked from impossible angles and retreated through routes that should have been impassable. One human destroyer was cornered by 20 Dominion cruisers near a gas giant's rings, and instead of surrendering, the captain flew his ship directly into the lead cruiser at maximum acceleration, destroying both vessels and damaging 3 others. The Dominion soldiers who boarded damaged human ships expecting to find survivors waiting to surrender instead found booby traps and explosive charges and crew members who fought to the last breath with nothing but improvised weapons. A report came in from the occupation force on New Helsinki. The human colonists had emerged from the wilderness in the dead of night and overrun the garrison, using nothing but hunting rifles and homemade explosives against soldiers in powered armor. They are not fighting to win, one of the admiral's tactical officers reported, its voice filled with something that sounded almost like fear. They are fighting to make us bleed. Admiral Vethtorak stood in his command center and stared at the casualty reports that seemed to grow longer with every passing day. And he tried to understand what he was seeing. The humans could not win this war. The mathematics were clear and undeniable. They did not have the ships or the soldiers or the resources to defeat the Dominion fleet, but they kept fighting anyway. They used nuclear weapons on their own positions, rather than allow them to be captured. They crashed damaged ships into enemy vessels rather than eject and survive. They charged particle cannons with nothing but kinetic rifles, and sometimes they actually... One human soldier in powered armor was recorded fighting for 3 hours after sustaining wounds that should have killed her instantly, taking down 11 Dominion warriors before she finally collapsed. A group of civilian refugees on a transport ship rigged their engines to overload when a Dominion cruiser tried to capture them, destroying both ships and everyone aboard rather than be taken alive. This is not war. Admiral Vethtorak transmitted to High Command, his voice betraying the frustration and confusion that had been building for months. This is insanity, but it was not insanity. Not really. It was something else entirely. Something that the Dominion had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest. It was spite, pure concentrated spite directed at an enemy that had killed 40,000 innocent people and laughed about it. Spite that burned hotter than any weapon and lasted longer than any battle. Spite that refused to die even when everything else had been destroyed. The humans were not trying to win the war because they knew they could not win. They were trying to make the Dominion pay for every inch of ground they took, for every colony they burned, for every life they ended. They were trying to make victory so costly that it would taste like ashes in the mouths of their enemies, and they were succeeding 6 months into the campaign. The Dominion fleet had lost more ships than they had in the previous 50 years of operations combined, and the war showed no signs of ending. Admiral Vethtorak stood on his bridge and watched another human destroyer ram another Dominion cruiser, and he finally understood what Observer Thalmira had tried to tell the Council. The humans did not surrender. They just became angry. Captain Elena Vasquez had been fighting for 6 months, and she had lost everything she had ever loved. Her husband had died in the bombardment of Mars. Her daughter had been on the colony ship that was destroyed trying to evacuate civilians from New Helsinki, and her son had volunteered for a mission that everyone knew was suicide and had never come home. She had nothing left except her ship, a battered destroyer called the Defiant that was held together with salvage and emergency repairs, and the stubborn refusal of its crew to give up. And she had nothing left except her rage, a fire that burned so hot inside her chest that she could barely breathe. The mission briefing had been simple in the way that suicide missions were always simple at Dominion Dreadnought. The Pride of Kethver was stationed at the edge of the Sol system, coordinating the blockade that was slowly strangling Earth into submission. The Dreadnought was the largest vessel in the Dominion fleet, a monster of metal and weapons that could destroy a dozen human ships without even trying. And it was named after the ambassador who had laughed when 40,000 humans died. Command wanted it destroyed, not because destroying it would change the outcome of the war, not because it would break the blockade or save Earth or turn the tide of battle, but because it was a symbol, a monument to the arrogance that had started this war. And symbols mattered. We don't have the firepower to destroy that thing, her first officer had said when she explained the mission. We don't have the weapons or the shields or anything that could even scratch its hull. Captain Vasquez had looked at him with eyes that held nothing but cold determination. We have one weapon they can't stop, she had said. We have mass and velocity and a crew that doesn't care about coming home. The plan was insane. The kind of plan that only worked in stories and legends. The kind of plan that no rational species would ever consider. They would accelerate to near light speed and aim directly at the Dreadnought's core, turning their ship into a projectile that carried more kinetic energy than 1,000 nuclear warheads. The impact would destroy the Defiant instantly, vaporizing every person aboard in a fraction of a second. But it would also destroy the Dreadnought, shattering the symbol of Dominion power and showing the galaxy that even the mightiest vessels could fall. Elena had given her crew the choice, the same choice that every human commander gave their crews before missions like this. The choice to stay or to take the escape pods and live. Every single one of them had chosen to stay for the 40,000, her weapons officer had said when she asked. Why? For my family on Earth, her helmsman had added. For humanity, her engineer had finished. Because someone has to show them what we are made of. The Defiant accelerated for 12 hours, building speed with every passing second. And the crew spent that time writing letters to people they would never see again and recording messages that might never be heard and making peace with the fact that they were about to die. The Dominion fleet detected them when they were an hour from impact. But by then, it was too late to stop them, too late to intercept them, too late to do anything but watch as the tiny human ship streaked toward the dreadnought like a bullet fired by the hand of an angry god captain. Vasquez opened the transmission channel in the final minutes, broadcasting on all frequencies so that everyone in the system would hear her words. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Earth Destroyer Defiant, she said, her voice steady and calm even as her ship screamed toward oblivion. To the Dominion forces in this system, to the Galactic Council, to everyone watching across the stars, she paused. And in that pause was every human who had ever been told they did not matter. Every human who had ever been dismissed and diminished and treated like they were nothing. For New Helsinki, she said, for the 40,000. For every species you have ever crushed beneath your boots, and every world you have ever burned, and every dream you have ever destroyed. The dreadnought loomed in her view screen, growing larger with every passing second. Humanity remembers, she said. And humanity does not forgive. The impact was visible from Earth with the naked eye. A flash of light that lit up the night sky like a second sun. And when the light faded, the pride of Kethver was gone, shattered into a billion fragments that would drift through space until the end of time. The footage of Captain Vasquez's final transmission spread across the galaxy within hours. Passed from ship to ship and world to world through channels the Council could not control and frequencies the Dominion could not block on 100,000 worlds. Beings who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of Dominion power watched the recording in secret, gathering in hidden places and darkened rooms to witness something they had never believed possible. Single ship, a single crew, a single act of defiance had destroyed the mightiest vessel in the Dominion fleet. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session for the third time since the war began. And this time, there was no laughter in the chamber, no clicking mandibles or chiming crystals. Celebrating the inevitable destruction of the primitive humans, High Counselor Iranathos demanded answers, demanded explanations, demanded to know how a species with 200 ships could still be fighting after 6 months of total war against an enemy with unlimited resources. Dominion Admiral who had been sent to explain could only describe what he had seen. The ships that rammed instead of surrendered. The soldiers who fought until their hearts stopped beating. The colonists who vanished into the wilderness and emerged to slaughter garrison forces in the dead of night. They are not fighting to survive, the Admiral reported. They are fighting to hurt us, they are fighting to make us pay. They are fighting as if victory and defeat no longer matter, and only the cost we pay has any meaning. Observer Thalmira sat in her usual place at the edge of the chamber. But this time, when she spoke, the other delegates listened. I told you they would not surrender, she said, her voice carrying the weight of vindication and sorrow. I told you they would become angry. And now you see what human anger looks like. She gestured at the image of the destroyed dreadnought, the scattered debris that had once been the pride of the Dominion fleet. They have a concept for this, she said. They call it defiance. It is the refusal to accept defeat regardless of evidence. The determination to keep fighting even when all hope is lost. Her eyes moved across the assembled delegates. We thought it was a weakness, she said. a flaw in their psychology that made them unable to calculate costs and benefits the way civilized species do. She paused, letting the silence stretch out until it filled the entire chamber. I begin to suspect it is their greatest weapon. In the outer territories, far from the war zones and the council chambers, something was stirring. The Vomari had been conquered by the Dominion 3,000 years ago, reduced from a proud civilization to a servant race that existed only to serve their masters. And for 30 centuries, they had accepted their fate, because what choice did they have? But now they watched the recordings from human space, watched the tiny ships that would not surrender, and the soldiers who would not stop fighting, and the captain who had turned her vessel into a weapon just to prove that the Dominion could bleed. And they began to remember what it felt like to hope on a dozen other worlds. Among a dozen other conquered species, the same thing was happening. The same spark of inspiration igniting in hearts that had long grown cold with despair. If the humans could fight, they whispered to each other in the darkness. If the humans could hurt the Dominion so badly with so little, then maybe there was still a chance for all of them. The resistance cells formed quietly, secretly, in the shadows where the council could not see. And they began to plan for a day when they might join the fight. Captain Elena Vasquez had died in the fire of her own making, but the flames she had lit were spreading across the galaxy, and they would not be easily extinguished. The war lasted 3 years, 3 years longer than anyone in the galaxy had predicted. 3 years of blood and fire and sacrifice that changed the shape of everything that came after. Humanity never won. Not in the way that victories are usually measured. Not in the way that the history books of the elder races would describe. The human navy was shattered, reduced from 200 ships to less than 30. And those 30 were so damaged and so battered that they could barely hold together long enough to fight one more battle. The 12 colony worlds had been burned, their cities reduced to ash, and their populations scattered across the stars as refugees. Survivors who carried nothing with them but memories of everything they had lost. Earth itself had suffered the worst of all. Its skies darkened by orbital bombardment, its great cities turned to rubble, its oceans poisoned by weapons that the humans had no defense against. 15 billion people had lived on that blue and green world when the war began. And when the guns finally fell silent, less than 8 billion remained. The Dominion had done everything they promised to do. They had crushed the human military and occupied the human worlds and killed so many humans that the species would take centuries to recover. And yet they had not won. The cost of victory had been staggering, so high that even the ancient accountants of the council could barely comprehend the numbers. Dominion had lost more ships to human resistance than they had in the previous 1,000 years of conquest combined. Their economy had buckled under the strain of endless occupation. Their soldiers had developed a fear of humans that bordered on superstition. But worse than all of that, far worse, was what had happened in the outer territories. 12 subject species had risen in open revolt, inspired by the humans who refused to surrender, emboldened by the knowledge that the Dominion could bleed. And those revolts had spread like wildfire through the Empire. The Velmari had been the first. 3 centuries of servitude ending in a single night of violence that left their masters dead and their chains broken. The crystalline hegemony had withdrawn from the council entirely, declaring that they would no longer support an alliance that had shown such weakness against a primitive species. A dozen other races had begun to question the natural order of things, to wonder if perhaps the hierarchy that had existed for 12,000 years was not as inevitable as they had been taught to believe. The Galactic Council was fracturing, cracks spreading through an institution that had seemed eternal, and everyone knew that the humans were responsible. High Counselor Irenethos called for an armistice, something that had never been offered to a species that had been defeated so thoroughly, something that acknowledged humanity as a force that could not simply be crushed and forgotten. The negotiations took 6 months. 6 months of arguments and demands and compromises that left both sides exhausted and bitter. But in the end, an agreement was reached. Humanity would retain 3 worlds: their devastated homeworld and 2 colony planets that had been too costly to occupy. And they would be granted full sovereignty over their territory with no restrictions and no boundaries. More importantly, humanity would be given a seat on the Galactic Council itself, a voice in the halls where their fate had been decided without their consent for 60 years. It was not victory, but it was survival, and for a species that had been scheduled for extinction, survival was enough. The signing ceremony was held on neutral ground, a space station that orbited a dead world far from both human and Dominion territory. And the delegates who gathered there represented civilizations that had never treated each other as equals. High Counselor Arenathos arrived first, his ancient body showing the weight of 9 centuries of life and 3 years of war that had shaken everything he believed about the natural order of the galaxy. He had expected the human delegation to be led by a politician or a diplomat, someone skilled in the art of negotiation and compromise. But instead he found himself facing a woman in a military uniform, her face marked by burn scars that covered half her features. Admiral Sarah Chun had commanded the human resistance for the final year of the war, holding together a shattered fleet through nothing but willpower and spite. And she had earned every scar that marked her skin. She was the daughter of Ambassador Chen Wei, the man who had stood before the council and begged for justice after the Horizon's dream was destroyed. And she had inherited her father's rage, along with his determination. The High Counselor studied her for a long moment, trying to understand the creature that stood before him, trying to comprehend how such a small and fragile species had managed to inflict so much damage on forces that should have crushed them like insects. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice carrying the weight of genuine confusion. "You knew you could not win. Your analyst must have shown you the numbers. Your strategist must have told you the odds. So why did you fight a war that you knew you would lose?" Admiral Chun looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death and too much suffering, eyes that held no hatred but also no forgiveness. "You want to know why we fought?" she said, her voice steady and calm. "You want to understand what drove us to sacrifice so much for so little?" She stepped forward, closing the distance between them until she could see every line on the ancient alien's face. "You killed 40,000 of our people," she said. "Men and women and children who had done nothing wrong except dream of a better life among the stars. And when we asked for justice, you laughed." The High Counselor said nothing, remembering the day when Ambassador Ketvorn's clicking laughter had echoed through the council chamber. "You thought we would accept it," Admiral Chung continued. "You thought we would bow our heads and go back to our cage and pretend that nothing had happened, the way every other species has done for 12,000 years. She smiled, and in that smile was every human who had ever refused to break, every soldier who had fought to the last breath, every captain who had turned their ship into a weapon rather than surrender. "But we are not like every other species," she said. "We are humans, and we do not accept being told what we cannot do." The High Counselor was silent for a long moment, processing her words, trying to fit them into a framework of understanding that had served him for 9 centuries. "You fought because we were certain you would lose," he said slowly. "You fought specifically because we believed you could not." Admiral Chun nodded. "You looked at us and saw a primitive species that posed no threat," she said. "You saw numbers on a display and calculated that we would be conquered in less than 5 rotations." Her scarred face twisted into something that might have been a grin. "You were so certain of your victory that you never considered what would happen if you were wrong." She turned away from him and walked to the window, looking out at the stars that had cost humanity so much to reach. "We knew we could not defeat you," she said. "We knew from the beginning that we did not have the ships or the soldiers or the resources to win a conventional war." She turned back to face him. "But we also knew something that you did not know. Something that your calculations could never account for." The High Counselor leaned forward, genuinely curious despite himself. "And what was that?" he asked. Tadmiral Chun's smile faded, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. "We knew that we would rather die on our feet than live on our knees," she said. "We knew that some things are worth fighting for even when you cannot win. We knew that sometimes the only victory that matters is refusing to be defeated." She gestured at the document that lay on the table between them. "The armistice that would end 3 years of bloodshed. You thought this war would be the end of humanity," she said. "You thought you would crush us and absorb us and add us to the long list of species that had challenged the Council and lost." Her eyes met his across the table. "You were right that it would be the end of something," she said, "but not the end of us." She picked up the pen and signed the document with a flourish, her signature bold and defiant against the formal text. This war was the end of the galaxy believing that humanity did not matter, she said. The end of the assumption that might makes right. The end of the certainty that the natural order can never be challenged. She set down the pen and straightened to her full height. A warrior who had survived everything the galaxy could throw at her. "From this day forward," she said, "every species in the galaxy will know what humans are capable of when we are told we cannot win." High Counselor Irenathos looked at the signed document, then at the scarred woman who had signed it, and he felt something he had not felt in 900 years of life. He felt respect. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the galaxy will never make the mistake of underestimating your species again." Admiral Sarah Chen smiled, and in that smile was the promise of everything humanity would become in the centuries ahead. A promise written in fire and blood and the stubborn refusal to ever give up. "We are counting on it," she said. The war was over. Humanity had survived, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again.